Rocky stayed with me for 3 years just to make his white Moonlight jealous. He took advantage of my affection, knowing I wouldn't leave him. He shamelessly stepped on me to amuse his white Moonlight. Later, I got amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. I let him go, but he thought I was just making a scene. It wasn't until he never saw me again that he went crazy searching for me everywhere. I had been with Rocky for 3 years, but the reason we were together was quite ridiculous. That day, after finishing a part-time job, I returned to the dorm in heavy snow. I saw him talking with another girl. I couldn't hear very clearly. All I heard was him saying, "Don't you need money? Here's 100,000. Will you be with me?" He handed her a card. The girl threw the card back at him and said, "Even though my family is poor, I won't allow you to insult me." I looked at her shoes. They were Nikes. Then I looked at mine, which had holes and were years old. Maybe my gaze was too intense. Rocky met my eyes. Rocky was also proud. He came over with the card and said, "This card has 100,000. Be my girlfriend." Anyone with a bit of self-respect would refuse. But I was not only short on money but also liked him. So I took the card and said, "Okay." Both Rocky and the girl were stunned. The girl, with tears in her eyes, said, "Rocky, you only have a bit of money. Is it necessary to humiliate me like this?" Then she covered her face and ran away. Rocky wanted to chase her. I grabbed his hand and said, "I've liked you for a long time, Rocky. I'm Haley, a freshman in the business school. Will you try to like me?" Later, I found out that the woman's name was Serena. Rocky had liked her throughout high school, and everyone said Rocky was infatuated. It's hard to imagine that Rocky would be with me. Facing such remarks, I just smiled. I knew Rocky didn't like me, but I always felt that where there's a will, there's a way. Regardless of the weather, I would wait for him downstairs at his dorm, run errands for him, bring him meals, and in the freezing winter, carry him to the hospital when he had a fever. I thought, even a stone should warm up eventually. Later, my mom called to say the family was out of money and my dad's condition had worsened. She asked me to figure out a way to get living expenses. In the past, I had always given my poverty student quota to others. But this year, I couldn't afford to. I got a certificate from the hospital and a poverty stamp from the village to prove my genuine need. Others, understanding my usual kindness, did not contest. But then Rocky sent me a message asking to meet. I changed into the best-looking clothes I had, but I didn't have a decent coat, so I didn't wear one. Outside, the snow and wind made me shiver. I was about to greet Rocky when I saw his expression wasn't good. I cautiously asked, "What's wrong?" He impatiently said, "Did you take Serena's poverty student quota?" "Take? The poverty student quota is awarded, not hers to claim." My lips were already slightly purple from the cold. "You," Rocky said, a bit impatiently, "are you really that poor?" I tried to reason with Rocky, but Rocky interrupted me. "Give her quota back. The list is with my uncle now. I've changed it to Serena. Don't you have the 100,000 I gave you?" He then looked at me disdainfully. "Even so, isn't that enough for you to spend? Serena is different from you. Although she comes from a poor family, she won't accept charity. She only has this poverty subsidy. Stop taking everything from her." But I remember Serena never contested before. My lips trembled as I lowered my gaze and asked, "Why this year?" Rocky said, "Because I registered her. I found out her situation is worse than I thought. She's not like you." I lowered my head and coughed a few times. Rocky draped his coat over me and said, "Why didn't you wear a coat when you knew it was cold outside?" "Haley, put away your little schemes. I don't like them." I adjusted the coat Rocky gave me and said, "But Rocky, those coats are too shabby to be seen by you." Rocky frowned and said coldly, "Given how you've been running errands, I won't let you suffer too much. 2,000 is enough? If not, there's more. But don't think you'll get any more." Later, I lost my poverty student quota. I used all the 100,000 to pay the hospital bills and lived in worse conditions than a dog. Rocky had been drinking, and his roommate called me to pick him up. I found their private room. The room was full of people smoking, drinking, and the table was covered with money. Rocky waved me over. "Come here." I felt awkward, but I walked over. "Hey, Rocky, I'm impressed. I didn't expect her to brave such heavy snow just to pick you up." My face reddened with embarrassment. Rocky immediately stuffed 1,000 yuan into my pocket and said, "You're short on money, right? Didn't I treat you well this time? Here's a little extra." As soon as he said that, the entire room fell silent. I felt even colder under Rocky's materialistic gaze. What was worse, the people in the room suddenly changed their expressions, and even said in front of me, "Looks like Rocky still remembers that little firecracker from before." Speaking of her, I remember I made just a few jokes, and Rocky beat me up and sent me to the hospital. "Little sister, if you're short on money, maybe you shouldn't stay with Rocky. He has someone he likes. Why don't you come with me? I have plenty of money." He looked at Rocky, seeing that Rocky didn't stop him, and became even more pleased. As long as you perform well, money isn't an issue. Come on, finish this bottle of wine, and I'll give you 10,000 yuan. My face turned pale. Rocky had beaten someone up for Serena, and I was being humiliated, but he remained indifferent. Yes, I lacked self-respect. So I didn't look at Rocky anymore and picked up the bottle of wine from the table. I had never drunk before, but that time I drank desperately, with laughter echoing in my ears. Rocky frowned, his hand firmly gripping the bottle, and his cold words were like a bucket of cold water over my head. Had enough of the drama? Is your life worth so little for this money? I shrugged off his hand and said softly, Rocky, if I died, wouldn't you be the happiest? I gently placed the bottle on the table, as I didn't want to break it and end up having to pay for it. I looked at the man and, despite my unsteady legs, extended my hand to him. I've finished drinking. Pay me. The man looked uncomfortable, but someone who had been silent laughed. Interesting. It was worth coming all this way for such a boring party. I hadn't noticed this person before. He was sitting in the corner with eyes like a beast watching me. Rocky, with a stern face, held me in his arms roughly and possessively. Tony, she's my girlfriend. It was the first time I heard Rocky admit I was his girlfriend. Tony leaned back on the sofa and looked at Rocky faintly. Let's see who says what in the future. I don't remember how I got out. When I woke up, my head was pounding. Rocky was sitting at the bedside, startled awake by my movements. He silently handed me a bottle of milk and asked, "Headache?" I shook my head. The clean room and the soft, comfortable bed made me realize I was probably at Rocky's place. I remembered Rocky saying he hated me touching his things. I quickly got out of bed, put on a jacket, and ran outside. Rocky, frowning, asked, "Where are you going?" I stopped at the entrance, turned to him, and said awkwardly, "I'm afraid I'll dirty your home." Rocky was stunned, and I put on my shoes and left. Later, Serena found out I had spent the night outside somehow. Serena, who hadn't looked for me in 3 years, came to find me the next day. She looked at me and asked, "Do you think Rocky likes you?" I didn't catch the arrogance in her tone. Thinking of Rocky's behavior, I still stubbornly said, "He does like me. Why would he? Rocky hates gold diggers like you." I looked at her seriously and said, "I'm not a gold digger, and I know you're not really poor." Serena's face showed some embarrassment. Stubborn. She then provocatively smiled and said, "Let's see if he cares about you or me." Her eyes were full of confidence and certainty, and I didn't believe it. A few days later, Rocky asked me out on a date, but I had a high fever that day. Still, since it was Rocky's first invitation, I went despite feeling unwell. I was so awkward that I didn't even know how to use the cutlery. I asked awkwardly, "Why did you suddenly want to date me?" Rocky looked up and said, "You're my girlfriend. Isn't it normal to go on a date?" Rocky's sudden closeness caught me off guard, and I felt like it was a dream. If it were a dream, I wished I'd never wake up. The next door was filled with arguing sounds. It seemed a waiter had spilled red wine on a customer. Rocky suddenly stood up. I asked, "What's wrong?" He said he was going out and patted my head. My already hot cheeks felt even hotter. I waited and waited, but Rocky didn't return. So I went out to look for him. Around a corner, I saw Serena leaning against Rocky. Our eyes met and she smiled at me. She was wearing a waiter's uniform. It turned out she was the waiter who had caused the trouble, and Rocky had seen it all along. Rocky gently wiped her tears. I leaned against the cold wall, lacking the courage to confront Rocky. I stood outside the restaurant, thinking I would never come back. Just as I was about to leave, my left foot suddenly wouldn't move, and my vision blurred. When I regained consciousness, there was no one in the hospital room. I had always avoided getting sick, and when I did, I always bore it alone. I pulled out the 4 needle from my hand and tried to escape in panic. Along the way, I nearly knocked over a nurse's cart. The nurse stopped me, and I thought she was asking for money. I grabbed her hand and weakly smiled. "Miss, I've only received less than a third of that for. Can you charge me for just a third?" I knew it was ridiculous and embarrassing, but compared to not having money, embarrassment was nothing. The nurse frowned, her face showing disapproval mixed with caution. "Student, do you know you have amyotrophic lateral sclerosis? You can't be discharged now." Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis? I knew about it. It meant parts of my body would slowly stiffen and decay, and then I would die. But my first thought wasn't about dying, it was that this illness would cost a lot. The nurse looked at me with sympathy and patted my shoulder. "Student, don't lose hope. The doctors will do their best." The nurse left. I stood there stunned, but the commotion had attracted many people. At that moment, a long, bony hand grabbed my arm. I turned to see Rocky's familiar face. He frowned and said impatiently, "Haley, are you done with your drama?" Then Serena's voice came from behind. "Rocky, I'm leaving. The medical expenses here are too high. I can't afford it." Rocky immediately let go of my hand and said urgently, "You got hurt for Haley's sake. It's only fair that you stay." "For me?" Rocky looked at me and said, "Haley, if Serena hadn't found you lying in the snow, your life would have been in danger. Don't you owe her a thank you? She fell down the stairs trying to save you. You should pay for your recklessness." "Thank you?" Serena smiled at me. "We're classmates in the same department. No need to thank me." Hearing their duet, I suddenly found it very boring. I took out a handful of coins from my tattered jacket and handed them to Serena, saying, "This is all I have. Or are you asking for my life? Stop pretending to be a saint. Every time you do, I get hurt." Rocky's face was filled with anger as he gripped my hand tighter, his teeth clenched. "Haley." Serena neatly stacked the money and handed it to me, saying, "I don't need you to insult me. Rocky and I have nothing to do with each other. If we had any relationship, you wouldn't be in the picture. I'll earn my medical expenses through working. You're right, kindness is my business. Whether you accept it or not is yours." "Kindness?" I was about to speak when Rocky interrupted, blocking me from talking to Serena. "Haley will cover this money." I looked at Rocky in disbelief. "Rocky, who are you to make decisions for me?" I pulled my hand from Rocky's grasp, feeling desolate. Seeing this, Rocky's face showed panic as he tried to grab me again. I had once wanted so much to touch Rocky, but now, I took a step back and said softly, "Rocky, it's been 3 years. Can you just let me go? That 100,000, consider it payment for me enduring you for 3 years. Rocky's hand stiffened. "Haley, stop causing trouble." I smiled and said, "If I could cause trouble, I'd just slap you." Rocky frowned fiercely, pulling my wrist with considerable force, and said angrily, "These 3 years of yours aren't worth 10,000 yuan. I fell silent. So, in Rocky's eyes, my 3 years of dedication weren't even worth 10,000 yuan. I broke free from Rocky, smiled, and said, "Since you say so, I'm not cheap. I'll return the 100,000. I turned to leave, and Rocky stepped forward, seemingly wanting to stop me. But Serena, pulling on his sleeve from behind, said, "Rocky, I know why you're with Haley, to make me jealous, right? I know Haley isn't your type." Rocky stopped in his tracks. I scoffed and didn't hesitate anymore. I walked quickly, thinking that if I cried in front of those two, it would be utterly humiliating. The next moment, I accidentally bumped into a doctor. He was tall, and I collided with his chest, noticing a pen hanging from it. Looking up, I saw it was Tony, the man I had encountered that night. His wild eyes were hidden behind gold-rimmed glasses, looking more refined than that day. He raised an eyebrow at me. Oh, a familiar face. Before he could finish speaking, Serena let go of Rocky's hand and quickly walked over, stopping a few meters away. Tony placed a hand on my shoulder and smiled. Seems like there are quite a few familiar faces today. Serena's face turned sour, and Rocky's was dark too. It was clear there was a story between the three of them. Rocky, with a scowl, said to me, "Haley, come here." But Tony's hand on my shoulder tightened a bit. Serena, holding back her laughter, asked, "Tony, where have you been all these years?" "That night, it wasn't as you thought. Rocky was drunk." Serena's eyes welled up with tears as she spoke. I had no interest in their love-hate drama, but I had gathered enough from their conversation. I was just a poor girl, and Tony and Rocky were clearly from a different social class. Serena was the one they both cared about. I should have understood that I didn't belong in this mess. I removed Tony's hand from my shoulder. Without saying a word, I bowed my head and walked toward the hospital exit. Passing a mirror, I saw my disheveled reflection. My face and lips were as pale as a ghost. So pathetic. After that day, I went home to see my parents. I didn't tell them about my ALS. Our situation was already tough, and I feared they couldn't handle it. Our family was not wealthy. During high school, my father fell seriously ill and lost his ability to work. Only my mother was left to support both me and my father with 2 jobs. Seeing my once vigorous father now suffering, I felt a lump in my throat. When my father was a bit conscious, he sent my mother out of the room. He said, "Daughter, could you buy me a bottle of sleeping pills? I'm leaving. Tell your mother not to worry. She's still young. She should find a good man." My father's tone was almost pleading. Tears streamed down my face. My father was worried about me and my mother. But didn't my mother and I also worry about him? I shook my head. "Dad, I'm about to graduate and will start earning money soon. You know, I'm at a good school. Once I graduate, I'll earn a lot. Then you and Mom will have a good life." My father closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his cheek. I had nothing more to say. After returning home, I took up several part-time jobs, working almost non-stop without a moment of rest. One evening, while heading out for a part-time job, I ran into Rocky and his friends at the basketball court. Normally, Rocky always scorned this basketball court, but for some reason, he was here today. He and his friends were playing basketball, seemingly unaware of me. Perfect. I lowered my gaze and quickened my pace. At that moment, a gust of wind blew, and I looked up to see a basketball coming straight at me. I instinctively tried to dodge, but my left leg started to fail me. The basketball hit me hard on the corner of my mouth. The smell of blood spread, and a hot stream flowed from the corner of my mouth. I looked at the group of people. His friends had gleeful expressions, while his hand remained suspended in midair. They did it on purpose, perhaps to vent Rocky's frustration. I wiped the blood from my mouth, lowered my head again, and limped away. Rocky, however, ran over and grabbed my hand. I turned to look at him without saying a word. He stared into my eyes for a long time before slowly releasing my hand. Haley, you're injured. He took out a piece of paper and extended his hand. I caught a glimpse of Serena approaching with 2 bottles of water. She was probably coming to find Rocky. I took a step back, turned, and limped away, looking quite disheveled to onlookers. Rocky's friends came over, poked him, and teased, "Hey, Serena's here, congratulations on getting the beauty. Haley's not only materialistic but also dared to dump you. It's really funny to see her limping." Rocky stayed silent for a moment before asking, "Did you guys hurt her leg?" "No, we just hit her with the basketball." "Isn't that to vent Rocky's frustration? The leg injury might just be karma." I stopped in my tracks. I picked up the basketball that had rolled to my feet and threw it forcefully at the speaker, my tone cold. "If we're talking about karma, the first one to face it is you." The person seemed stunned by my sudden assertiveness. Ironically, despite my deliberate attempts to avoid these people, today I ran into everyone I didn't want to see. Not only Rocky and Serena, but also Tony, who was blocking my path. I pretended not to see him and walked past. No matter where I went, Tony followed. It turned out he was deliberately blocking me. I stopped, looked up at him. "Tony, if I'm not mistaken, we've only met twice. Did I offend you in some way? Or do you want to take out your anger for Rocky?" Tony raised his hand, his thumb brushing over the injury on my mouth, his voice slightly hoarse. "What if I do want to vent for him?" I turned my head, gripping his wrist, and stared into his eyes. "It's less than 200 meters to the police station from here. If you want to go in for a chat, I won't stop you." Tony was slightly taken aback, then a smile appeared in his eyes. "I thought you would come closer to let me vent. I'm not that cheap. Whether it's Rocky or Tony, in the end, they both see me as a mere plaything. Why did I ever fall for Rocky? Perhaps because after living in darkness for so long, I mistook the light for sunshine. Rocky and I are from completely different worlds. He's confident, has many friends, and is cheerful. The moment he smiles, it felt like I was healed. Unfortunately, he never truly smiled at me. Anyway, I've tried, and the outcome is what it is." Thinking of this, I gently asked Tony, "What do you want from me? After all, I'm so fond of money." Tony said nothing and waited outside until I finished my part-time job. By then, it was past 11 o'clock, and the street had only a few people. He leaned against the railing, smoking a cigarette, seeming more accustomed to the night than I was. When I came out, he extinguished the cigarette and tossed it into the trash can, checking his watch. "It's so late. Can you still get back to the dorm?" "Yes, but I'd face some harsh words from the dorm supervisor." "I'll give you a ride." Tony's car was parked nearby. Although I didn't know much about cars, I recognized the emblem. It was the same as Rocky's car, which I had seen once. I was silent for a moment and then said, "Tony, what exactly do you want? Have you fallen for me after seeing me twice? You're not like that." Tony stopped and raised an eyebrow slightly. "Then tell me, what kind of person am I?" I made no movement or response. Tony opened the passenger side door and leaned against the car, his eyes still like when I first met him. As if he was a beast and I was his prey. "Get in." Seeing that I hesitated to move, Tony smiled. "What? Afraid I'll eat you? Didn't you always want to know what I want? Get in, and I'll tell you." I got into the car, and the interior was exquisitely decorated. There was a silver rabbit charm that stood out. It was old-fashioned, with a nearly full-length engraving. Seeing me stare at it for a while, Tony asked, "Do you like it?" I shook my head. In high school, everyone in class had a lucky charm related to their zodiac sign, said to ensure good luck for the college entrance exam. My dad promised to get me one for my birthday, but he broke his promise and was diagnosed with a serious illness that day. I never mentioned it again. I looked out the window. So, what do you want? I want you to leave this place. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me a screen. You know this company, right? I've reserved an interview slot for you. Not just knowing it, it was practically legendary. It's a company every business school student dreams of getting into. Without connections, no matter how excellent, one wouldn't even touch the company's threshold. I turned off my phone and smiled. Tony, you've put in quite an effort, haven't you? He didn't answer and continued, also, I'll cover a part of your dad's medical expenses. In exchange, after you leave, you must not have any contact with anyone here, including your parents. He then took out a new phone card. Accept it if you agree. Is this to erase my traces here? But the conditions were indeed so good that I couldn't refuse. I took the phone card and gently said, no need for the medical expenses. I got $30,000 from drinking before, so it will last a while. Once I join the company, I'll rely on my own abilities to earn money for my dad's medical expenses. By the way, I still owe Rocky $100,000. I'll transfer it to your card, and you can pay him back. The car slowly stopped at the dorm building, and I opened the door to get out. Haley. It was the first time Tony called my name. I turned to wait for him to continue. After a moment of silence, he said, take care of yourself. I love myself more than you imagine. I closed the car door and walked towards the dormitory entrance. As I approached, I was suddenly yanked hard, and a familiar voice carried anger. Where have you been so late? Colliding with the cold wall, a sharp pain shot through my back, making me frown. I looked up at Rocky. His eyes were filled with anger and displeasure, but there was no probing curiosity. He didn't care at all why I was coming back so late. I pulled my hand out of Rocky's grasp, speaking in a flat tone. I was working a part-time job. Part-time job? Who are you trying to fool? Rocky crossed his arms, his expression one of disdain. Have you seen Tony a few times and gotten so close already? He moved closer slowly, his eyes full of malice. If I had known you were so worthless, I wouldn't have bothered. 100,000 yuan, and you didn't even get into bed with me. I'm really losing out. I was stunned, and a wave of emotions surged through me in that moment. Seeing me stunned, Rocky seemed to regain a bit of sanity, opening his mouth as if to say something but ended up saying nothing. Silence spread between us. I raised my eyes, hiding my emotions well. I took out the notebook from my bag. It recorded every amount Rocky had given me over the past 3 years, totaling a scattered sum of 106,250 yuan. I wrote down an IOU and handed it to him. This is the money you spent on me over the past 3 years. I've signed it, just sign it, and it's done. I stuffed it into his arms and didn't say another word. Taking advantage of his stunned moment, I turned and left. After walking a few steps, I turned back and said softly, it was a mistake for us to be together. Starting tomorrow, this mistake will no longer exist. I walked quickly. Rocky had just come to his senses and called out my name, Haley. His voice sounded urgent and anxious, but people aren't always moving forward unhesitatingly. My relationship with Rocky has reached its end. Once I've repaid Rocky, we will no longer owe each other anything. When packing my things, my fingers were starting to feel stiff. Maybe I should ask a doctor how many more years I have left. I sent a message to my parents telling them not to worry about me. Then, I broke the old phone card in half and threw it in the trash. My WeChat was full of messages from Rocky. He asked what my last message meant and wanted to meet me tomorrow. I didn't reply or delete him as a friend but simply logged out of WeChat. Then, I used the new phone card to apply for a new WeChat account. After a while, a friend request came through. The verification message had only 3 words, Tony. After accepting, he sent me the schedule for tomorrow. A flight at just past 6 o'clock. Good. It would be a quiet departure. Come to the school gate tomorrow. I'll give you a ride. Tony sent another message. No need. I can go by myself. Tony didn't reply. The next day, I woke up and called the dorm supervisor at just after 4. Seeing my usual bad mood, the dorm supervisor said sarcastically, students should focus on studying. Hearing this, I stopped, neither angry nor hurried, and turned to the dorm supervisor. The dorm supervisor should manage the dormitory well. After saying that, I closed the door. The dorm supervisor's face alternated between blue and purple. At the school gate, I took out my phone to order a cab. A hand snatched my phone away. I'll take you. When we arrived at the airport, Tony's expression was somewhat complex. Haley, if you're still attached to Rocky, it's not too late to refuse me now. I glanced at him and smiled. I'm tired. It's time for me to pursue my future. The day I left, it snowed the heaviest it had ever been. To others, snow might represent romance. But to me, snow means the cold, which I don't like. When I arrived at the new place, I passed the interview and got into the company, and I also went to see a doctor. The doctor said I was young, and as long as I exercised every day, I could slow down the time of my death. Maybe I could live another decade or so. A decade. Enough to earn enough money for my parents. In the 6 months after joining the company, my salary rose from 15,000 to 20,000 yuan a month. I received an additional 50,000 yuan for working overtime during the new year. In these 6 months, I saved enough to repay Rocky. I transferred the money to Tony. He asked if I had any other messages to pass on. I thought for a moment and replied, none. Although I exercised regularly, my body still occasionally experienced sudden stiffness, but it only lasted a short time. To prevent muscle atrophy, I got a gym membership and learned dancing and yoga. Who would willingly die early if they could avoid it? Tony sent me messages every day, but they were just ordinary greetings. Until 2 months before my graduation, he asked me, Haley, do you want to know how Rocky is doing now? Mentioning Rocky felt like a century had passed. Before I could reply, he continued, Serena will be interviewing at your company in a few days. After a pause, he added, Rocky gave her the interview slot. I replied after finishing my last yoga pose, so, do I need to leave again? At that moment, there was a knock on the door. I frowned slightly. I didn't have any close friends in the company, and there was no one I knew here. Who could it be at this hour? Through the peephole, I saw a familiar, unruly face. But now with gold-rimmed glasses, it subdued the wildness in Tony's eyes. I opened the door. Tony? Tony leaned against the door with a suitcase, his voice low. You don't have to leave, but you might have to let me stay for a while. I silently nodded. Aren't you going to ask me why? There was nothing to ask. Serena had just arrived, and Tony showed up right after. It was quite obvious. I shook my head. I don't want to know about your matters. Tony looked momentarily stunned, then smiled. Are you afraid I'll silence you? I was crouching down, packing up the yoga mat, and casually asked, when are you leaving? Tony sprawled out on the sofa, took off his glasses, looked at me with a smirk, and said, depends on my mood. I took a deep breath, thinking my patience was quite good. Yet, Tony's words managed to test it. Smiling, I walked over to him and looked down at him. He looked back at me. The next moment, I placed my foot on the one he had dangling. Then I'd appreciate it if Master Tony could tidy up the room himself. Tony's face scrunched up. You're being too harsh. I sighed. In the past 6 months, I had filled my time to the brim. I kept my distance from colleagues and avoided offending anyone. I thought my life had finally settled down, but it seemed that peace was destined to be disrupted. As soon as I arrived at the company, a colleague stopped me and dragged me to the restroom. Our relationship was somewhat complicated. Initially, she was quite antagonistic towards me. Later, after I completed a task for her and she heard my conversation with the doctor, learning about my ALS, her attitude softened. In the company, if anyone spoke ill of me, she would confront them. She said urgently, I heard from HR that they're hiring someone to replace you. That person went to the same school as you, and apparently has some connections. We've all seen your abilities. Why should she get your position just by joining now? Replace me? Let her do it then. I lowered my gaze. She looked at me with disappointment. Can't you be a bit more assertive? Challenge her. Our company isn't just about connections. If you're capable, they'll keep you. I was about to speak when HR called me away. It was similar to what she said, but it wasn't about firing me. It was about making me do tasks for Serena. After half a year, I had become an intern doing tasks like serving tea, refilling water, and writing documents. It seemed Tony hadn't told me the truth. It wasn't an interview slot, but a direct appointment. On Serena's first day, she looked at me as if she had seen a ghost. Haley. I ignored her and placed the documents and coffee on the desk, saying, here are the documents and the fund's performance for today. Even after 6 months, she still had that superior attitude. Turns out you were here all along. Who helped you get in? Tony or Rocky? No, it can't be Rocky. Otherwise, Serena trailed off, closing her mouth in panic, afraid I'd ask about what comes after otherwise. But I didn't have the time for that. Interns are the busiest, especially with trivial tasks. But I had become quite adept at it over time. When I handed her the documents, she whispered in my ear, Haley, cherish your time here at the company. Do you know who the chairman of this company is? It's Rocky's uncle. I glanced at her and smiled. Serena, grow up. Instead of competing with me, why not work on developing the skills needed for this position? Serena snorted. We'll see about that. During lunch break, Serena went to HR. Clearly, HR didn't agree with her. So, when she came back, she looked quite embarrassed. My good colleague, with a sarcastic smile, patted me. People like her are full of schemes. Just ignore her. The twist came 3 days later, the day after I saw Rocky. Tony had been busy at a downtown hospital, working around the clock. With the fridge empty, I went out to buy groceries. Passing by a Western restaurant, I saw Serena and Rocky having dinner together. I stood there for a long while, recalling the times Rocky and I had dined in a similar restaurant. Awkward but happy. They used their forks and knives with perfect form, and even Serena looked like a proper lady. I snapped back to reality and hurried past them, feeling my steps quicken. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but I thought I heard a familiar Haley. Back home, I suddenly missed my parents. I rarely cried, but today the tears just wouldn't stop. When Tony came back, he found me crying while holding a bowl of tomato egg noodles. What's wrong? Is the noodle too delicious? He then picked up a pair of chopsticks and took a few noodles from my bowl, tasting them. It's actually quite good. I was so flustered that my tears flowed even more. That's my noodles. Tony crouched down and gently wiped the tears from my face. Did you see Rocky? I nodded and brushed his hand away. Tony, I no longer have any value for you to exchange. You don't need to comfort me like that anymore. I didn't say the rest, saying it would be awkward for both of us. But Tony clearly understood. Tony sat on the carpet and lit a cigarette. So, you know everything? I do, I said softly. In my senior year of high school, I almost got killed by people sent by my brother. Do you know who contacted my brother? Why this sudden question? I looked puzzled but shook my head. Tony exhaled smoke and said hoarsely, Rocky, my best buddy in high school. I was stunned, never expecting Tony to reveal this. Why are you telling me this? Tony glanced at me. Don't you know I asked you to leave to target Rocky? Target Rocky? Wasn't it for Serena? What about you and Serena? Tony smiled. We weren't close, but Rocky, because he liked her, was eager for my family to know about me and bring me back. But how would he know this would cost me my life? I gathered my emotions and said softly, then you've targeted the wrong person. For Rocky, I'm just someone he dislikes. Without me, he'd be happier. You've done a good deed by repaying hatred with kindness. Someone he dislikes? Tony leaned back on the sofa lazily. You really don't have a clear understanding of your own position. But I think I have a clear understanding of my position. Early in the morning, I was notified by HR not to come to work. Serena smiled at me. How come you're fired? She walked slowly to my side. Did you see Rocky yesterday? I just mentioned wanting to switch roles, and he replaced me with someone he used to be with. I thought I'd be deeply affected, but now I felt quite calm. Move aside. You're blocking me from packing up. Exactly. My good colleague pushed Serena away and tearfully grabbed my hand. If you leave, who will handle the tasks we can't finish? Others seemed to think of the troublesome scene and gathered around. Serena put on a different face, smiling and saying, I'll work hard to lead everyone. I won't be worse than Haley. Don't worry, everyone. But they only listened. In the company, it's always about merit. A university student like Serena, who hasn't experienced much and has climbed so high in position, has little persuasive power. I packed my things, bowed to everyone, and smiled. Thank you all for your care these past 6 months. I walked out holding a cardboard box, looking anything but disheveled. If one path doesn't work, I'll find another. I won't starve to death. Just as I reached the ground floor and greeted the security guard, I ran into Rocky. He was holding Serena's bag. Rocky stood there stunned, mumbling, Haley. It had been over half a year since I last saw Rocky, and he seemed to have lost quite a bit of weight. I walked past him as if I hadn't seen him. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his voice trembling slightly. Have you been here the entire time? I looked at him and took a small step back. His movement made Rocky freeze. He pulled out his phone and opened our chat history. It was all green. I've been sending you messages every day. Do you know how I've been these past 6 months? Are you blaming me? I didn't answer but asked, have you received the money I owed you? Rocky put his hands on my shoulders, turning me to face him. Haley, I don't want your money. I want the old you who was wholeheartedly devoted to me. Ha! But Rocky, didn't you destroy that version of me yourself? I forced a smile. Why do you think people don't change? Move aside. Rocky's expression showed surprise, and he closed his eyes in pain. The next moment, when he opened his eyes, they were filled with pleading. Haley, give me a chance. I've searched everywhere for you these past 6 months, including your parents' home. You seem to have vanished without a trace. I even thought about giving up, but every time I closed my eyes, all I could think about was you. Haley, I've fallen in love with you. I can't live without you. Hearing him say he loved me, I was stunned. I looked into Rocky's eyes and scoffed. Rocky, if you had said this 6 months ago, I might have been overjoyed, but now, look at me. Am I happy? Rocky tried to find any hint of surprise or joy on my face, but failed. His lips were pale, showing deep anxiety. As I took a few steps away, Rocky looked at my cardboard box and asked, "It's working hours. Where are you going?" I stopped and turned to him, speaking softly. "Thanks to you, I'm the little assistant you had me fired." "No way." Rocky's face was shocked, his tone insistent, but the fact was what it was. I ignored him and walked outside. He followed, seemingly wanting to explain, but a familiar voice stopped us both. "Haley, let's go." It was Tony. He was waiting outside the company. Seeing Rocky following me, he grabbed me. He then placed a hand on my shoulder, pulling me into his embrace. "Tony." Rocky clenched his fists. Tony continued to smile. "After all these years, your feelings for Serena are still the same. Let Serena see how impressive it is for the chairman's nephew to personally deliver a bag. A mere illegitimate child like me can't compare to you." Rocky clung to the bag, looking panicked. "Haley, it's not like that. Let me explain." I buried my face in Tony's embrace and said, "Let's go, Tony." Once in the car, Rocky stood dejectedly by the roadside. Tony glanced at me. "I'm fine." After a moment of silence, he said, "I just found out about your dismissal." I leaned back in the seat. "Anyway, I've paid back what I owed, and there's still money left for Dad's treatment. Now I need to go home and see my dad. Mom said Dad's condition is almost healed. Once I get home, see them, and get my diploma, I'll look for another job." I turned to Tony, and his expression was gentle. "Then take a rest. I'll go back with you." On the way home with Tony, he mentioned that since we were partners, it was only reasonable to buy some things for my parents. I didn't stop him. I bought a lot of things, but when we got home, the door was locked. In my hurry, I had forgotten to bring the house keys, so I waited outside. Dad needs rest after his serious illness. Where could they have gone? When a neighbor came back from grocery shopping around noon, they looked surprised and said, "Daughter, why are you only coming back now? Didn't your dad pass away yesterday? They've probably already sent him to the crematorium." What? My hands went weak and I collapsed. Tony caught me. "Haley, did I hear that correctly?" I looked at Tony, my eyes brimming with tears. Tony nodded solemnly. "Then why did Mom say Dad was recovering?" Overwhelmed by grief, I tried to steady myself. I need to go to the crematorium, at least to see him one last time." Tony drove quickly. At the crematorium, I searched for people until I saw my mom, looking drained. Mom turned around, and I hugged her tightly. "When did Dad pass away?" "The day before yesterday." Mom touched my face, trembling. "Your dad said before he left that you were busy and didn't want to trouble you." I broke down, crying uncontrollably. "Mom, do you know how painful it is not to see Dad one last time? Has Dad been cremated?" Mom shook her head. "Not yet. I saw Dad for the last time, not just a cold tombstone. He lay with his eyes closed, looking peaceful in his departure." I trembled as I held his hand. "Dad, remember the rabbit brand in your next life, okay?" Tony wanted to comfort me, but was stunned when he saw my dad. After handling all of Dad's affairs with Mom, I told her, "Dad said you're still young and should find a new husband who will love and care for you. Dad and I share the same view. I'll save a lot of money for you." Mom pinched my nose and said, "I'm getting old and don't have much to offer. Why should you spend your money on me? Save it for your own dowry." I shook my head and smiled without speaking. Tony frowned slightly, unsure if he understood my implication. In these past 10 days, the company offered me a salary increase in the hopes that I would return. Still for the same position. Who would turn down money? Tony and I set off to go home. He pointed to the old rabbit silver pendant and said, "This pendant saved my life. I've kept it in my car all this time. But this pendant isn't mine. Now that I've found its owner, guess who it is?" I had a guess, but still shook my head. Tony took the pendant and put it around my neck. "It's you." My father did not break his promise. No matter how it happened, I only knew that my father always remembered. Holding the rabbit pendant, I smiled from the bottom of my heart. "Tony, thank you." Tony looked at me for a long time, as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he said nothing. Back at the company, the happiest person was my sarcastic good colleague. My good colleague was almost buried under piles of documents recently. She complained to me that Serena can't do anything right. The documents are piling up, and there's a mountain of fund securities to analyze. As she spoke, Serena arrived at my desk, speaking loudly. Haley, you're so shameless. Back in college, you were fawning over Rocky, but Rocky liked me. I thought you had given up. What, now you're starting your old fawning tricks again? After saying that, she slapped me. I raised my hand to block, but it wouldn't respond. The loud slap echoed through the office. Why didn't she block it? Is she guilty? I heard people whispering. Is it very hard to say I have ALS? Yes, it is. I don't want to use my weakness to suppress others, but I won't allow others to bully me. After my hand regained sensation, I struggled to raise it. My good colleague slammed her hand on the desk, protected me behind her, and pushed Serena to the ground with a shove. You dare push me? I pushed you. So what? You're taking your anger out on Haley. Doesn't that suitor of yours now like Haley? Serena's face turned from red to blue. Did I hit the mark? If you have the ability, go find that man. Bullying Haley is nothing. Truly shameless. My good colleague's outburst made Serena, a small-time troublemaker just entering society, cry and run away in shame. She patted my hand and asked softly, "Are you okay?" I shook my head and smiled at her. You're quite the fighter. That's right. Her expression was as proud as could be. Haley, the chairman wants to see you. The chairman? My good colleague and I exchanged a glance. This was my first time taking the chairman's private elevator to his office. When I arrived, I didn't see the chairman, only Rocky. He looked at my red, swollen left cheek and reached out his hand. I still took a step back. I just want to apply some medicine. I said, no need for medicine. I'm not that delicate. Then there was another silence. Rocky hugged me tightly, his voice trembling. Haley, what can I do to win you back? Rocky's embrace still had a youthful quality, which was the embrace I longed for back then. Now, Tony's embrace gives me more security. I gave up struggling and said softly, Rocky, you say you love me. I have a request for you. Can you fulfill it? Rocky's eyes lit up, excitedly saying, you say, I will definitely do it. I pushed him away, my expression cold, my tone calm. Back in the hospital, you asked me to pay for Serena's medical fees. Did you know I was diagnosed with ALS? I only have a few years left to live. My request is that you never appear in front of me again. After I die, don't even come to burn paper for me. Just pretend I never existed. Rocky's face turned pale, and he even bled from his mouth. I don't know. He sat on the sofa, as if lost, and then punched himself, one punch after another, muttering, Haley, I'm sorry. Looking at Rocky like this, he seemed to have some sincerity, but I wouldn't turn back for that sincerity. After returning home, Tony sat on the sofa, keeping the room in darkness, hiding all his expressions. Why aren't you turning on the lights? As I fumbled for the light switch, Tony lit a cigarette and exhaled a puff of smoke, saying, Haley, have you seen a doctor? I was momentarily stunned, then realized what he meant. I responded softly. The doctor said, at best, I could live for another 10 years. Tony's voice was somewhat strained. So you've been saving money to avoid having your mother being mistreated, is that right? You've thought of everyone, but have you thought about yourself? I didn't turn on the lights, sitting across from Tony. He was the only person I felt like I could confide in. After some thought, I said, I've thought about it. I'll arrange the best funeral for myself, and then pray for a better life in the next one. Tony suddenly stood up and sat beside me. Then you could totally hire me. Aren't we the best partners? I can take care of you, and after you die, I'll make sure your funeral is the best. And I'll pray with you for a better next life, and that you'll meet a great partner like me earlier. Tony would probably be sad when I'm gone, but a bit of selfishness is okay. So I nodded and extended my hand to him. Pleasure working with you. Later, Rocky indeed never appeared in front of me again, but I could always feel his intense gaze, almost as if it were self-punishment. The intensity was especially strong when I was with Tony. My good colleague continued to protect me, and Serena seemed to become a clown. Life got better and better, but the disease kept worsening. Sometimes my limbs would go numb. During those times, Tony would personally feed me. The affected areas grew larger, and the duration increased. I saw anxiety in Tony's eyes. I smiled at him and said, Tony, the doctor has taken good care of me, but he had lost the fearless, rebellious demeanor he once had. Colleagues were all waiting for Tony and me to get married, but only I knew that Tony and I would never marry. I had once suggested ending the contract with Tony, but he, despite his cleverness, was stubborn. He said he wanted me to remember to find him earlier in the next life. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye. Most of my body had completely lost sensation. Tony, as usual, crouched down to manage my hair. It was indeed beautiful. Tony had become more mature, fitting the type of man girls liked these days, but the sorrow in his eyes had deepened. Tony, will you forget me? Tony was silent for a moment, then familiarly took out a lighter from his pocket. He lit the lighter but didn't smoke. Tony actually had quite a strong smoking habit, but he quit because he was afraid my body couldn't handle secondhand smoke. He spoke with some choking in his voice. No. I wrote a letter to my mother, and one to my good colleague too. What about mine? You'll find it, because for the past 5 years, I had been writing little things to Tony every day, even if just to share. And our photos were all stored on his USB drive. Then I asked Tony to lower his head, kissed the corner of his mouth, and smiled. Tony, see you in the next life. Tony tightly grasped my hand. Haley, I love you.